everyone. Welcome to the March 4th, 2025 meeting of the City Finance Committee. May I have a roll call, please?
Yes. Committee member Harmon is not present. Committee member Santa Maria?
Here.
Chair Friedman?
Here. We do have a quorum present, so I will open up to general public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to items not on today's agenda but under the purview of the Finance Committee? Not seeing any in chambers. Are there any online?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
I'll close general public comment and turn it over to Mr. DeMartini to kick us off for the 5-year capital plan improvement program.
Thank you so much, Chair Friedman. Today's agenda item is to talk about the staff's proposal for the 5-year capital improvement program for fiscal years 2026 and all the way through 2030. So staff have been working on the CIP for the last number of months, and this is the very beginning of this process. It will then flow into the budget process where staff will recommend expenditure appropriations for capital projects in the 26 and 27 fiscal year budgets. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the Acting Public Works Director, Mr. Brian Demore.
All right. Thank you, Mr. DeMartini. Happy to be here to present to Finance Committee just an update on where we're at with the 5-year capital improvement program. This is a document we put together every 2 years, and it looks ahead 5 years with really a strong focus on the first 2 years of that 5-year plan, because that becomes the basis of our 2-year capital budget. And today, the focus is really on a programmatic basis rather than on an individual project basis. We have taken, individual departments have taken their programs to various boards and committees over the past several months. And last month, we took new projects that have been added to the CIP to the Planning Commission. I'll actually get into kind of where we're at in the process on a next slide. If you can just slide that over, I'll just, yeah. So what is a capital project? You know, just to be brief with this, it's an investment in infrastructure. It may be new infrastructure. It may be reinvesting in existing infrastructure, typically a fixed asset, something like seen here, which is a bikeway, multi-purpose pathway. We have a lot of different infrastructure items within our city, just based on the variety of things that we have under our control, from airport to waterfront, you know, going from A, not quite to Z, but A to W. The goals of the CIP, it's really a planning document. Like I said, it looks ahead over a 5-year period at necessary capital improvements. It identifies unmet capital needs, and then it tries to match up, like I said, in those first 2 years with anticipated funding levels. So there are way more needs than we have funding for, but the purpose of the plan is to capture all of those needs, but to constrain it in the 2 years, which it says there on that third bullet point. And it also, it helps to secure grant funding. If you identify those needs and some of them you know you don't have funding in hand for, but there could become a funding source could become available, it's a good tool to have those projects identified and listed. So where are we at right now with this edition, I guess, if you want to call it that, of the CIP? There was a kickoff meeting, a staff meeting held actually in this room in the fall. And one of the things that was strongly encouraged with this time around was to limit the number of new projects in the CIP. We had, the document has grown over the years, and there are a lot of unmet needs already in the document. So the focus was really to try to prioritize what was in there and focus on delivery of the existing projects that were in there. So we didn't add as many new projects as we have in the past. I mentioned the board and committee reviews have been taking place over the past several months, and that we went to Planning Commission last month. Up next, we're planning to be at the full council next week, and in that meeting, we'll have a draft document available with the full listing of individual projects. And then what we're going to do a little bit different this time around than we've done in the past. So typically around March, council would see the draft CIP, and then that would be the last action that council would have taken on it. And after that, there would be continued budget development, and that includes the capital programs throughout the city. So what would get approved in the budget would not always look the same as what was in the CIP. And what we're going to do this year, we'll take it to the council next week as a draft document, and then based on those final budget deliberations, we'll true up the CIP to match the budget. And then that'll all get posted when the budget's approved in June. It's just some information here about the variety of different funding sources that we have and some of the restrictions. And this may not be new to the committee, so I'll be pretty brief on this, but kind of going around from 12 o'clock, if you want to call it that, clockwise around, generally from least restrictive to most restrictive. You have general fund, which also includes Measure C, and then we have our enterprise funds, inter-service funds, designated funds, which is more like Measure B, or UUT, gas tax, those types of funding sources. Grants, which are typically project-specific. They can only be spent on a particular project and often have timelines for delivery. And then the most restrictive would be if we've taken on debt or we have loans where there's a legal obligation to pay that back in certain time periods. So what I've done for today is grouped our different capital program areas based on the primary type of funding that they receive. So they're listed here in that manner with enterprise, special revenue, internal services, and general fund. And I'll just go through each group and then the individual programs within each, basically just to talk about some of the highlights within each of those programs. So starting with the enterprise, actually, the slides are not in the order that I was remembering. So before jumping into that, just wanted to talk a little bit about prioritization. So this is something that often comes up when we present on CIP, and there's a variety of things that play into how we prioritize projects. You've got needs and plans and then funding, and they all are pulling in different directions. So there isn't an easy formula, although this appears to be like a formula. You add these things up and it spits out a prioritization. In the past, we didn't ever try to plug anything in to help with that, but we did talk about these types of things that are listed here, such as safety and obligations to maintain existing assets, and then our planning documents, working with other agencies, certain requirements, and then of course the funding sources that are available and the restrictions associated with that. But what we did this time with this document, this was another change. We created these different items that were used as a methodology to help score projects. It wasn't a ranking process necessarily, but just a tool to look at on each individual project basis these different categories, which I'll list off here, but included external funding, impact on city budget, risk management factors, whether there was a state or federal requirement, quality of life and wellness, critical infrastructure, so typically that would be public safety, but also things like water and wastewater would fall under there. Legal obligation, strategic plan alignment, council or advisory board recommendation, community benefit, and project readiness. So all of these factors were considered for every project within the CIP, and points were assigned based on established criteria for each of those. And that helped with our process of ranking the project, but it wasn't used as the sole factor in determining whether or not a project would be recommended for funding. The next couple of tables are just some quick summaries of total dollar amounts, first by program area and then by funding source. So you can see here we're at about $2 billion worth of identified capital needs within our plan. You can see about half of that is listed as a future need, so it's not an immediate need, but it is something that's on the radar and will be needed in the future. But there is still about $1 billion, actually over $1 billion identified in the first 5 years. And then the first two, which is the important part for our budgeting purposes, you can see that's, again, about half of that, or $470 million. There's still some work to be done, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure this is all constrained to available funding. But we're pretty close in most of the program areas, which we'll get into in more detail. And here are the sources of funding. So this matches up with the amounts in the previous table, but it is broken out by the various different types of funding that we have, which you can see. General Fund Measure C is at the top of the list, but I can tell you right now we do not have that much funding available in General Fund in Measure C. So that's where a lot of the work is still needing to be done to get this constrained. But everything else below that does line up with identified funding either in hand or reasonably anticipated to be in hand. But you can see how much grants play into our capital program. And then we have taken on some debt or have some loans. So that's another big piece of our funding for capital. So now I will jump in to the different projects based on their primary funding source, starting with enterprise. These are typically self-sustaining operations. That's the goal for each of them. And they receive funding based on, essentially based on customers, whether it's water and wastewater or airport. The use of the facility helps to fund the operation. And they're legally restricted. Those funds have to stay within that program. So I'll just go through each of those. And again, today is not intended to look individually at projects, but really just higher level programmatically at each of these areas. So starting with airport, their operation is primarily funded from revenue they receive from parking, airline leases, and they have a lot of rental properties out there. But their capital program is primarily funded through FAA grants and entitlements. They have 37 projects in the CIP, and you can see some of the major capital projects, which council should be aware of at least a couple of these. The terminal improvement project, which I know has been in front of council recently, but they've also got the taxiway B extension, and then an ongoing need is pavement rehabilitation, taxiway pavement rehabilitation. Golf, this is a very small enterprise fund, not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but you can see a little bit under $2 million annually that they feed into their capital program through revenue generated from golf course operations. And then downtown parking. What I want to highlight here is something that I know has been in front of the council before, but it's worth mentioning just that this fund continues to be in a program deficit, and they're unable to fund the necessary capital work to maintain infrastructure at the levels that are recommended. In FY25, there were some Measure C funds put towards downtown parking capital to help with some of the immediate needs. But moving forward, there are going to need to be some changes made to address that program deficit. There are 17 projects listed for downtown parking in the CIP. But as you can see, looking at FY26 and FY27, there's not a lot of funding. We did push most of the funding out into the 3 years or into future because of the limited funding availability. One thing that is going to move forward, is recommended to move forward, is a parking structures and facility assessment update. So just we can have a better idea of what the needs are. That was done previously, but we wanted to update that. And then they're still working towards the parking access control system modernization, and as much as they're able to, facility maintenance, just annual repairs. Wastewater, this again, like I mentioned before, revenues with these enterprises, it all comes from the users. So this is the utility ratepayers. They do have opportunity to tap into state revolving fund for loans for some of their capital projects. And rate increases were approved through FY28, which helps to offset inflation and fund this capital program. They have 8 projects listed in the CIP. One of the most significant projects they've taken on recently is under construction right now. It's the El Estero Electrical Project. There's another project under construction right now at the Braemar Lift Station. And I did want to also mention the Sanitary Sewer Capacity Improvement Program. And there's some similarity between this and with water, but with some of the larger potential development projects around town, it's important that the wastewater program plan for that and make sure that they have capacity to take on some major redevelopment work that may be happening, and staying ahead of that just to make sure that the system can handle, whether it's on the wastewater side or on the water side, has the ability to handle that. Moving to water, again, kind of similar setup, similar with the rate increases also. They have 11 projects identified. It's a much bigger capital program than wastewater. The water main replacement program continues to be a primary area of focus. A big individual project that's in the early stages right now is the Vic Trace Reservoir Replacement Project. And then, of course, there's the desalination program where we need to continue to invest in capital for that program. The last enterprise fund is Waterfront, and they receive funding from a variety of sources, including leases, parking, and slip rental and fees. They have a capital program, 27 projects listed, and investing a little over $2 million annually into that program. One big project that they have planned to kick off is the Marina Replacement Project. Some of the marinas, I think it's 2, 3, and 4. It's been quite a while since they've been updated, and looking to do replacements there. And then the annual maintenance and repairs at the marina and the wharf, that continues to be on their program. And added as a new project this year is the commercial area improvements, which is focused on the areas, I believe it's by Stearns Wharf, just areas that really interface most with the public. So that was it for enterprise. City has two programs that are primarily funded through special revenues, and we'll highlight those in just a bit. But these are restricted revenues. They have to be used for that specific purpose, and they are kept separate from the general fund. Creeks is funded primarily by Measure B. They have 15 projects in the CIP. Some of their major projects that I wanted to highlight today, one is this Mission Creek restoration at De La Vina Bridge. So there's a streets project happening where FHWA funding has been secured to replace that bridge, and we have acquired property in order to construct the bridge, and there's been a partnership between Public Works and Creeks to make sure that at the end of that project we're able to do a restoration of a significant stretch of Mission Creek adjacent to the bridge project. So that's listed here, as well as stormwater treatment LID projects and just more of a generic creek restoration line where they're looking always for opportunities to invest in creek restoration throughout town. And streets. So I mentioned a little bit about streets, but this has a variety of different funding sources: utility users tax, Measure A, and gas tax being the primary ones. And that typically funds the operation. At this point, there aren't sufficient funds from those sources to also fund much of a capital program. So the streets program as a whole is very reliant on Measure C and grants for capital projects. They have 61 projects listed in the CIP, and some of the major projects, as I mentioned, that De La Vina Bridge replacement project, of course, annual pavement maintenance, and then the active transportation program grants. Those are 3 different projects, one focused on Cliff Drive, one that's focused on Milpas, and then there's a third that's on the west side with a primary component along Modoc. So next are the internal services programs, where we have energy management, facilities, fleet, and information technology. These programs operate through charges to other departments within the city, and typically only do minor capital work through the cost allocations that they receive, but they do have a component of Measure C, which we'll get into, and you'll see on some of their more major projects. So starting with energy management, they have 19 projects listed in the CIP, and primarily EV charger projects. You can see listed here is a variety of different locations: Harbor Parking Lot, Eastside Library, and Corp Yard. Next is facilities, with 26 projects listed in the CIP, and these are mostly Measure A funded projects, not through the rates, through the ICS, but a major piece is the ADA transition plan, where a lot of work has been done in the last year to kind of renew some of the documents that we had from the past and see where we're at on completion of that, and then deploy some of the funds that have been previously appropriated to make progress on that transition plan. ADA, the City Hall elevator and restroom, that'll actually be headed to council for a recommendation very soon to award a design contract for that work. And then just fire station renewals, all of our infrastructure really are in need of renewals, but being critical infrastructure, public safety infrastructure, the fire stations are a very high priority. Fleet, again, another internal service program. Their capital work is really in the fleet replacement, which is part of the ICS. However, they did request one standalone project through the Measure C, which is new auto shop lifts, which were impacted by flooding. I think it was a couple of winters ago. So they just have those two projects listed. And then last for ICS is information technology, which now has 12 projects listed in the CIP, the biggest one being city radio infrastructure replacement, where that's kind of a region-wide coordination effort. And then there's also citywide telephone upgrades and GIS database redesign. This is probably one area that's grown the most since the last version of the CIP, and a lot of that has to do with having information technology now as its own department, and just working with them on the needs that they have and getting their needs into the document, which in the past wasn't necessarily as well coordinated. And then on to general fund. These are kind of your traditional government services, community development, police, fire, parks and rec, library, funded through general fund. And really without Measure C, there wouldn't be a lot of opportunity for capital. So all of these programs rely very heavily on Measure C for capital. I'll go through those. So community development, they just have a few projects listed. Basically, they're longer range planning documents. They're not able to fund through their operating budget. So there's a few things listed here. State Street Master Plan and State Street Design Services, as well as General Plan Update. And then fire, 8 projects listed, a fire station renewal at Station 7, and then a new project added this year is the self-contained breathing apparatus replacement. So this is a big capital investment that comes on not every year, but when it hits, it's a big item, and there's really no other way to fund that were it not for Measure C. So those are due for replacement, and that's in the capital plan, as well as portable radio replacements. Library has 8 projects listed. A lot of work has been completed recently at the Central Library. So for right now, you can see in FY26 and FY27, there's not a tremendous amount of funding allocated towards library. They do have 8 projects listed in the CIP, and their major projects include some equipment replacement, but then getting started on this East Side Library garage. It's really a place to store their library on the go vans, and not just the van, but also space to house things for their programming that they do within the community. And Central Library Fire Protection, where they did secure some outside funding to assist with that project. But there is, I believe, a city match component. Parks and Rec, a big capital program with 35 listed projects. You You can see they're in about the $4.5 to $5 million range annually. Several significant projects listed here, one being the Dwight Murphy project, and then not too far behind that one in progress is the Ortega Park project. And then Los Baños is in need of some immediate reinvestment in that facility. And then there's also a long-term plan to do a more major capital improvement project there. Police, big dollar amount that you see here. It's only 2 projects. The bulk of the amount is paying the debt. It's the debt repayment for the bond proceeds that we have for that project, for the police station project that's underway. And then they also have an equipment replacement line item in the capital plan. And that's it for the different programs. I did want to focus just a little bit on the Measure C capital program, and then we're basically done. We have staff here today from the different program areas that can answer questions if you have any. But Measure C, it's the primary funding source for most city programs other than those enterprise programs. And I mentioned the tool that we came up with to help with prioritization. Also, there were priorities established by the Citizens Oversight Committee and adopted by Council. Some of the key projects include the police station, Dwight Murphy, and annual pavement maintenance, all of which were mentioned previously. Right now, the estimated annual revenue is about in the $34 million ballpark. When the first cut of the CIP, I think we were closer to $100 million worth of requests annually. We've trimmed that down substantially at this point. There is a significant deferred maintenance backlog. What's constraining that program for the next few years is going to be the component of the police station project that we need to cash fund. So that's about $15 million. And actually, I think I described it incorrectly when I was on that police station slide. The debt repayment is not that $15 million. That's mostly the component that we need to cash fund. And there's going to be another one in FY28. That amount is less well known because it will depend on how much contingency funding gets utilized on the project. But because of that, those 2 amounts in 26 and 27, we don't have the typical amount available for Measure C. So it's going to be a bit of a leaner capital program for the next couple of years. And you'll see that when we bring the funding plan to the full council. And as I mentioned before, we're still refining, and when the budget's adopted with the capital plan, the CIP document will also be updated to reflect that. So that's all I had. Just reminding the committee that the purpose here was to just receive this report of where we're at with the draft plan. And as I mentioned, not only am I available, but we've got quite a crew of staff available if there are any questions. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes.
Member Santa Maria.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I just had one question from slide 9, the CIP project prioritization. There were several different categories used to help determine prioritization. I was just curious, how many of these categories minimum should a project check off for it to receive that sort of prioritization?
Councilmember Santa Maria, that's a good question. I didn't get into very much detail on what we did with these categories. So we actually established a spreadsheet, and we just, for each item here, there was a score given, just quantitatively. So it wasn't a checking a box whether or not it does one of those things or does not do one of those things, but on a scale, how ready is this project for construction? Or for any one of these, like on the external funding, what percent of the project is funded externally versus internally? So using that criteria, numbers were plugged in, and an overall score was given for each individual project. And so it wasn't a matter of checking the box or not. But in doing that, we were able to sort of see from top to bottom. It didn't necessarily matter what the score was compared to what the maximum score was. It was more just looking at the projects relative to one another, how they fell on that list from top to bottom. And like I said before, we didn't rely on that as the sole factor in determining funding, because there's a lot of other factors involved and there's different funding sources. So it was a tool that we used, and we'll likely refine that tool as we move forward with different editions of the CIP. Yep.
That's really helpful. Thank you. One follow-up question to that. As committee members, are we able to see the details of how this system was applied to these various projects? I'm sure it's a lot of data, so if it's complicated to share, I understand, but just curious if we're able to see those numbers.
Right now, we're not including it in the document. This was our first time using this model for prioritization. We can talk about whether or not, if it would make sense to include that in here. We felt like for right now, it was probably going to create more questions than answers. But I will say that, I have in front of me here, this is the entire draft document, which will be released soon. The project prioritization right now is not included in that. It talks about the methodology that was used, but it doesn't break down all of the detail.
Thank you. It's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? I have just two questions. First, if you could pull up slide 7, just more of a clarification. Where does Santa Barbara Clean Energy and Sustainability Department fall within this? Is it energy management or enterprise fund?
Yes, Chair Friedman. So Santa Barbara Clean Energy is an enterprise fund, so it falls in the enterprise fund category. At this time, that enterprise does not have really any significant amount of capital, right? They're mostly procuring energy contracts, and so it's not a capital intensive enterprise like those listed here.
Okay, that's why it's not in there.
And under sustainability and resilience, there's also the Creeks division, which is on here, the Measure B, which is on that second column as well. And then also, there's another enterprise that's not listed here under enterprise. It's the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund, which is our franchise agreement with Marburg, which again is under sustainability and resilience. There's, again, very little capital investment in that operation as well.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for the clarification. I see Mr. Litton coming up if you want to add to it.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Jefferson Litton, Energy and Climate Division Manager. Just wanted to add a little bit more clarification to that. The bulk of work that's coming out of Santa Barbara Clean Energy and Energy Climate Division, we are looking to fund through power purchase agreements or contracts with EV charger installers. So there is not necessarily a large capital expenditure with that, but there is, in some cases, going to be some capital that we're using Santa Barbara Clean Energy funds for.
Thank you for the clarification. And it just caught me that it wasn't there, so I just wanted to bring it up. The other question I had is related to downtown parking. So the capital, as I understand it from the presentation and previous, is that some of their capital has been shifted to Measure C funds?
Chair Friedman, that is correct. In the fiscal year 25 adopted budget, Measure C is funding a handful of capital projects for the Downtown Parking Enterprise Fund.
And then follow up before you go, Ms. McAdoo. Assuming at some point that the parking revenue comes back up with as downtown, we get more cars and everything down there, would we then relook at taking some of that Measure C back out if the revenue comes up?
So two things. I think we're still evaluating whether and how we're going to proceed with the projects that were appropriated last year. And just given the constraints on Measure C funding this year and the police building and the amount of money that we're needing to dedicate, we're looking internally at whether we'll just sort of pull that back for this at this point from the downtown parking fund, and then once we know what parking system we're going to be utilizing, then come to council with the funding plan for it. That'll free up some Measure C dollars in this year for current projects. I would recommend, and I'm sure Mr. DiMartini would second this, that it would be a loan from Measure C to the downtown parking fund that would get repaid over time. So if we end up using that, we'll make sure to structure it that way, and we'll have more conversation. We've been working internally. I think there's a revised budget proposal and sort of structure that the downtown parking team is going to be presenting to the CBID and some of the downtown business and property owners, and then coming back to the parking committee, and then bringing back to council for a conversation.
Okay, so those funds that are now appropriated from Measure C, they're being looked at in terms of how we might be able to find other sources or delay or defer some of the
Correct.
capital to account
And that
for
was this year, you saw the proposal for the assessment. So basically, we took out the funding for all of the capital projects that were planned in this year and are just doing the kind of facility needs assessment, which will give us a 5-year plan for, kind of what parking structures need to be rehabbed, repaired, kind of what are those capital projects that are needed. That'll help us plan out for the next 5 years what funding we need in the downtown parking fund for that. And it's just a planning tool. So basically are not funding anything except for that assessment update this year.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions. I'll open up to public comment. Not seeing any in the room. Are there any members of the public online who wish to speak to this item?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
Great, I'll turn it back to my colleagues for any comments. Member Harmon? All right, I guess there's no comments. I just want to say thanks for thank you for all the work that goes into this and the clarifications today on this. And I like the new approach to trying to true them up to the actual budget as part of this year's plan. And today, it doesn't look like we have any actual action items, so it's just informational only. So unless there's any other comments, we are adjourned. Thank you.